moments in life that do not announce themselves as salvation. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary, unremarkable instants. A breath taken after an argument, a silence that isn't filled, a stranger's glance that simply says, "I see you." People imagine that saving a life requires grand gestures, but the truth is much softer. Most lives are saved in secret, in the stillness between collapse and choosing to continue. Sometimes salvation sounds like nothing at all. You see, human beings are always looking for meaning in thunder, in the loudness of transformation. But existence, in its infinite wisdom, often whispers. A person is rarely rescued by epiphany. More often, they are rescued by presence, a cup of tea offered without expectation, a moment of being listened to without being fixed. When the world feels unbearable, what we crave is not resolution, but recognition. The sense that life still holds us, even when we can't hold ourselves. I remember someone once saying, "The day I stopped pretending to be okay was the day I didn't need saving anymore." That is the first quiet moment, the surrender. We spend so much energy trying to maintain the image of coherence, the face that says, "I've got this." But something in us begins to suffocate beneath the performance. When that mask cracks, when tears come without apology, that is not collapse. That is the body reclaiming truth. The surrender that feels like breaking is often the beginning of real healing. If this feels familiar, stay with me. Because you may not realize how many times you've already saved yourself, not with brilliance or strength, but with the simple decision to keep breathing in a moment that felt impossible. You might think it was nothing, but in the eyes of the universe, that small act of continuation was a bow to life itself. There is another moment, when someone finally sees their reflection in another person's pain. Empathy, you see, is a mirror that dissolves isolation. When you notice that someone else struggles to get out of bed, that they too feel like they are failing at being alive, something shifts. The illusion of separateness thins. You are no longer alone in your suffering, and that softens it. The human heart was never meant to carry its burden in silence. It was meant to echo, to resonate, to be known. There's a tenderness in realizing that others have walked through the same shadows and survived. That recognition can rewire despair. It's not about advice or solution. It's the quiet knowing that pain is not a personal defect, but part of the shared weather of being human. The rain falls on all of us. Another life-saving moment often arrives as stillness. The first time someone sits in silence without needing to distract themselves. In a world that equates motion with purpose, stillness feels dangerous. We think if we stop, we'll vanish. But when we finally stop running, we discover that the silence is not empty. It's full of gentle awareness. The fear we've been avoiding is not a monster. It's a child waiting to be held. That moment of stillness is not the absence of life. It's life noticing itself. And then there is forgiveness, not the grand, performative forgiveness we tell stories about, but the quiet kind that happens at 2 a.m. when you finally stop hating yourself for what you didn't know before you learned. Most people carry the weight of who they used to be like a punishment. They forget that growth always involves ignorance, that wisdom is born from the soil of mistakes. The moment you forgive the one who didn't know better, the younger you, is a moment that saves a life because it restores innocence. Sometimes a person is saved by the sound of their own laughter returning after years of silence. It may happen during a conversation or while watching something silly, and they suddenly realize they can still laugh. Life still has texture. That tiny sound carries the vibration of belonging. It says, "You are still here. You are still capable of joy." We underestimate how powerful that is. There's also the moment someone lets love in without needing it to fix them. That's when relationships stop being rescue missions and start being shared awakenings. The love that saves us doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with gentleness. Someone who doesn't demand that you be cheerful. Someone who sits with your storm and doesn't flinch. Love, in its purest form, is the permission to exist as you are, and that permission changes everything. The next moment comes when someone realizes they don't have to know their purpose to be valuable. We are conditioned to chase meaning, as though our worth depends on it. But the tree doesn't need a purpose to exist. It simply grows, breathes, and offers shade. Perhaps the same is true for us. The pressure to justify our being is what exhausts us. The moment we stop trying to prove we deserve to be alive, life starts to unfold again, effortlessly, like water finding its course. And yet, some lives are saved by grief itself. Because grief, though it feels like destruction, is also a form of devotion. It means something mattered. It means love existed. In mourning, we are reminded that our hearts are capable of deep attachment, and that capacity, though it hurts, is what makes life sacred. To grieve is to keep loving in the absence of form, and that love, though invisible, continues to sustain us. There's a moment when someone decides not to end their story, and though no one may ever know it, that decision changes the entire universe. They may not feel brave, they may not feel strong, but they have touched something beyond hope, a quiet understanding that life, no matter how painful, still wants to be lived. That impulse to continue, to stay, is the pulse of existence itself beating within us. And then there's the smallest moment of all, when someone looks at the sky and for a brief instant feels part of something vast. That moment doesn't remove pain. It expands the container that holds it. Suddenly, suffering is not the whole picture. It's a wave in an infinite ocean. To feel connected to the whole again is to remember that we were never truly lost. The lives that are saved quietly are rarely celebrated. But if we could see the invisible record of human endurance, the moments people chose gentleness instead of despair, truth instead of denial, breath instead of silence, we would bow in reverence. Because salvation is not a miracle. It is a pattern of small mercies, repeated in the privacy of the soul. And perhaps the most beautiful thing is this: we are all saving each other, unknowingly, through our sincerity, our patience, our being. A stranger smiles at you, and you feel less like a ghost. A child laughs, and for a moment, you remember lightness. These small exchanges are the real architecture of hope. Sometimes, what saves a life isn't the ending of pain, but the rediscovery of meaning within it. And that realization leads us deeper. What we call being saved is rarely a single event. It is a collection of moments, like soft threads weaving a net beneath the falling self. And the net is made not of control, but of surrender, the willingness to let life hold you when you can no longer hold yourself. People often misunderstand surrender as defeat, but it is actually the highest form of participation. It is the moment you stop arguing with what already is. There's a quiet miracle in realizing you don't have to earn rest. Most people move through life with a deep, unconscious belief that stillness must be deserved. They keep themselves busy, hoping one day to feel worthy of pausing. But the universe never demanded proof from you. The trees are not busy being trees. They simply are. Rest, when chosen consciously, is a return to alignment with existence. That's why exhaustion often feels like despair, because somewhere in us, we forgot that being is enough. Another saving moment comes when someone realizes they no longer have to carry the entire story alone. In conversation, the kind where words fall away and presence does the speaking, something sacred unfolds. The other person doesn't need to understand every detail. Their very listening becomes a kind of sanctuary. To be witnessed without interruption is one of the rarest medicines. It tells the soul, you are safe now. That feeling alone can pull someone back from the edge. Notice how many of these moments are quiet. The world worships the dramatic, the transformations that make headlines. But the psyche is not healed by spectacle. It is healed by safety, repetition, gentleness. You can see this in the smallest gestures, the way a cat curls against its human, the way a friend texts, "Are you up?" without demanding conversation. These are not small things. They are the architecture of belonging. And belonging is life's most reliable safety net. Sometimes, what saves a person is simply realizing that their feelings make sense. Think of that. How many of us nearly perish under the weight of believing we're overreacting? When someone tells you, it's okay to feel that, it rewires an old script, the one that said your emotions were inconvenient or excessive. Validation, though often dismissed as indulgence, is the moment emotion completes its journey. What we validate, we free. What we deny, we imprison. And then there is the moment of solitude that doesn't hurt anymore. At first, being alone can feel like punishment, as though silence itself is accusing you of being unlovable. But when solitude matures, it transforms into spaciousness. You begin to see that aloneness is not emptiness. It's intimacy with existence. The walls stop echoing, and instead, they breathe. You realize you are not waiting for someone to arrive. You are finally arriving to yourself. A life can also be saved by art, not necessarily grand creation, but the moment expression becomes more important than perfection. The act of painting, writing, singing, even humming, it's the psyche remembering that it can translate pain into form. When suffering is given rhythm or color, it stops consuming and starts communicating. That's why art feels like exhale. It's the soul saying, I am still here. And then the recognition that time does not heal everything, but presence does. Time is passive. It simply moves. Presence is active. It listens. When you stop measuring your healing by the calendar, you start noticing the subtle shifts. A breath that no longer tightens, a song that no longer stings. Healing is less about erasing the wound and more about befriending it until it stops needing to scream. There's another kind of quiet salvation. The moment someone stops trying to be positive. Positivity, when forced, is just another disguise for fear. It says, if I don't smile, the darkness will win. But the darkness doesn't need to be defeated. It needs to be understood. Real peace doesn't come from banishing shadow. It comes from integrating it. The moment you allow sadness to exist without trying to fix it, you discover something profound. Sadness is not the opposite of happiness. It is part of its depth. Sometimes, what saves a life is remembering play. Adults often forget that play was once how they learned trust, how they explored the world without fear of failure. When someone laughs, dances, or builds something for no reason, they reconnect with that original innocence. The inner child, long silenced by responsibility, suddenly breathes again. And in that breath is life, raw, spontaneous, unmeasured. There's also the mysterious power of nature. To walk among trees and feel their quiet indifference to human struggle is strangely comforting. They don't demand you be healed. They don't ask for explanations. They stand there, ancient and present, reminding you that existence doesn't need to make sense to be beautiful. Sometimes, simply watching the light move through leaves is enough to remember that impermanence is not loss, it's motion. And have you noticed how many people are saved by being needed? Not in the manipulative sense, but in the genuine awareness that their presence matters to someone. A pet waiting at the door, a friend who says, "I'm glad you're here." These tiny acknowledgments reaffirm something sacred. We exist in a web of interdependence. We are never isolated selves, but ripples in a vast pond. Even when you feel invisible, someone somewhere feels your absence. Then there's the strange grace of humor, the ability to laugh in the middle of chaos. Humor is the soul's rebellion against despair. It doesn't deny pain. It dances with it. When you can find absurdity in your suffering, you reclaim agency. The tragedy doesn't disappear, but it loses its authority over you. That brief laughter, especially in darkness, can be a bridge between who you were and who you're becoming. Sometimes the saving moment is simply honesty. The first time someone says, "I'm not okay," and means it. That sentence cracks open the prison of pretense. Suddenly, others can reach in. Vulnerability, though it feels like exposure, is actually invitation. It says, "Meet me here in truth." And from that meeting, healing begins. Not because pain vanishes, but because it finally has company. Another form of salvation is curiosity. When despair whispers that nothing matters, curiosity replies, "But what if it does?" That question, fragile and almost invisible, keeps the door open. Even the smallest wonder about a sound, a color, a person's story, is a thread back to life. The moment you ask, what happens next, you've already decided to stay. And sometimes, the moment isn't emotional at all. It's physical. A deep breath that lands differently. The body loosens, the chest opens, the eyes soften. The body, in that instant, remembers safety. This is not trivial. The body often heals before the mind gives permission. To breathe consciously is to remind the nervous system that the danger has passed, even when the mind still doubts it. That's how healing sneaks in, through the simplest act of being alive. And in the quiet spaces between all these moments, something subtle happens. The identity built on survival begins to dissolve. You no longer define yourself by what almost destroyed you. Instead, you become curious about what it means to live without the armor. This is the moment the soul begins to stretch, not in search of meaning, but in recognition of its own infinite nature. Each of these moments, surrender, empathy, forgiveness, stillness, play, is a doorway, not to escape life, but to enter it more fully. And beyond those doors, something waits, something that has been patient all along. Let's step through together. There comes a time when the search for salvation softens into noticing. You no longer chase moments that will save you. You begin to see that they are already happening, constantly, in the unnoticed rhythms of existence. The warmth of water on your hands, the small mercy of breath continuing on its own, the pulse in your wrist that asks for nothing, yet gives everything. What once felt like survival becomes participation, a quiet agreement with life to meet it, moment by moment, without demand. The need to be fixed gives way to the realization that nothing was ever broken, only unfolding. And this unfolding has its own intelligence, one that doesn't ask for understanding, only trust. There's a tenderness in realizing you've already crossed the bridge you were waiting to find. The self you tried to save has been living all along in the pauses between your thoughts. Every sigh, every hesitation, every half-remembered dream, all of it was life, whispering, "You are still here." And perhaps that's the final secret, that being saved is not about being spared, but being seen. To be seen by life itself in its infinite patience is to recognize that you were never separate from it. You have been the woe and the ocean, the seeker and the sought. Sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is simply stay long enough to witness yourself becoming again. No certainty, no promise, just the quiet faith that this too belongs. Because even now, as you listen, something in you is breathing a little easier. Not because I've told you anything new, but because you've remembered something ancient, that to be alive is already to be held. And perhaps that is enough.